Have you ever felt like affection in your family had a price? Like being seen, heard, or loved wasn't a birthright, but a competition? That wasn't dysfunction, that was design. Because in narcissistic families, love isn't given, it's rationed. And the cost is connection. This isn't where the story ends, it's where it begins. Because once you understand how affection became a weapon, you stop blaming your sibling and start dismantling the system that made you rivals. In a healthy family, affection is stable. It doesn't fluctuate with behavior, obedience, or convenience. It exists as a baseline of care, a foundation you don't have to earn. But in narcissistic family systems, affection takes on a different shape. It becomes unstable, contingent, and deeply manipulative. You're not loved for who you are. You're rewarded for who you pretend to be.
From the outside, it might have looked like discipline, but it wasn't about structure, it was about control. Love was doled out in small, inconsistent doses, enough to keep you hooked, but never enough to feel safe. One day you're praised for being polite. The next, you're punished for being too quiet. You learn early that affection doesn't follow a pattern of fairness. It follows a pattern of power. And if you want to stay close, you have to adapt. Children don't interpret this as manipulation. They internalize it as failure. If love disappears, they assume they caused it. If affection feels unpredictable, they work harder to earn it. That's the trap. You don't question the system, you question yourself. And over time, this confusion becomes a worldview. Affection is not something I deserve, it's something I must secure. And the way to secure it is to perform.
The performance takes different forms. Some children become perfect, quiet, high-achieving, endlessly agreeable. Others become useful, funny, helpful, emotionally attuned to the parent's needs. Some simply disappear, learning that invisibility is safer than risking rejection. But no matter the strategy, the message is the same. Connection is not safe unless I'm earning it. This is what makes the illusion so powerful. You're not told directly that love is conditional. You're shown it through micro-reactions, silent treatments, emotional withdrawal, through the way your parents' eyes narrow when you speak too honestly, through the tension that enters the room when you express something inconvenient. Over time, your nervous system begins to predict it. You anticipate the distance before it arrives. You monitor your tone, your words, your needs, not to be manipulative, but to survive. And eventually, you stop asking for affection at all. You just work for it. And when you don't receive it, you blame yourself. Not the parent, not the system, yourself. That's the illusion, that the problem is you. That if you were just more agreeable, more helpful, more obedient, you'd finally be loved in a way that felt secure. But it's not true. The love you were chasing was never stable to begin with. Because it was never built on care, it was built on leverage. This is the foundation of the system. Before you ever competed with your sibling, you competed with yourself, trying to eliminate the parts of you that seemed to get in the way. That wasn't dysfunction, that was conditioning. And the next part reveals how that conditioning didn't stop with you. It turned your sibling into the next obstacle. Because in systems like this, affection isn't just earned, it's fought for. The moment affection becomes conditional, the family stops functioning as a unit and starts operating like a marketplace. But this isn't a market of goods, it's a market of worth, and the currency is emotional proximity. You learn that love is available but limited, that closeness is possible, but only for one person at a time. And if you want to be the one who receives it, you have to win. That belief, subtle, invisible, and installed early, creates the foundation for an emotional economy, one that doesn't just govern your relationship to your parents, but to your sibling too. In this system, affection isn't just unstable, it's scarce, and that scarcity isn't natural, it's engineered. Parents who operate from narcissistic structures manufacture the feeling that there's never enough love to go around. They create hierarchies out of their own children, not to support growth, but to preserve dominance. One child gets validation, another gets comparison, one gets closeness, the other gets distance. These dynamics are rotated, switched, weaponized, but never stabilized. That instability keeps you competing, because the moment someone else becomes favored, you feel yourself slipping. This is where the sibling rivalry begins, not as an emotional reaction, but as a survival strategy. If only one child can be seen, you start watching your sibling like a threat, not because you hate them, but because you fear them. If they're doing well, it must mean you're doing poorly. If they're praised, it must mean you're falling behind. Affection becomes a scoreboard. Every interaction is an invisible ranking. Every conversation is a chance to gain ground or lose it. You begin to monitor, not just yourself, but them, their behavior, their moods, their proximity to the parent. You might notice how your mother softens when they speak, or how your father's tone sharpens when you enter the room. These aren't minor observations. They're data points in a system you're unconsciously decoding. You're learning how to survive inside an environment where affection isn't offered freely. It's distributed as a reward. And like any scarce resource, it creates conflict where there should have been connection. This system doesn't just fracture closeness, it replaces it. Your sibling becomes the person you compare yourself to most, the person who reflects back everything you think you're not. Maybe they got the grades, maybe they had the temperament, maybe they figured out how to disappear just enough to avoid blame. Whatever the case, you don't see them as someone surviving the same system. You see them as the one stealing your oxygen. But the truth is harder to accept. They weren't stealing anything. You were both just drowning, reaching for the same limited supply of care, praise, attention, and neither of you understood why it was so hard to breathe. That's what happens when a family teaches you to survive affection like a resource. You stop relating, you start competing, and before you even know it, your nervous system is no longer searching for love. It's tracking the threat of losing it. In the next section, we'll uncover how this survival economy doesn't just split siblings, it assigns roles. And those roles aren't reflections, they're weapons. Once affection becomes a scarce resource, the family begins to organize itself, not around connection, but around utility. Every child becomes a function, not a person, not a soul, not an evolving being, but a role. And those roles aren't chosen. They're assigned, not because of who you are, but because of what the parent needs to maintain emotional dominance. The golden child, the scapegoat, the lost child. These aren't identities, they're positions in a system designed to keep everyone occupied and no one united. At first, it doesn't look like control. It looks like favoritism, discipline, maybe even structure. One child is rewarded for being easy, another is punished for being expressive, a third is left alone altogether. But over time, the pattern becomes undeniable. The rewards aren't based on truth, they're based on function. The golden child is praised, not because they're better, but because their success flatters the parent's image. The scapegoat is blamed, not because they're wrong, but because their defiance exposes the system. And the lost child is ignored, not because they're neutral, but because their silence keeps the peace. None of these roles reflect reality. They reflect necessity, emotional necessity. The golden child keeps the illusion alive that this is a healthy family, that the parent is capable, that everything is fine. The scapegoat carries the shame the parent refuses to face. They become the family's emotional trash bin, absorbing rage, failure, and resentment that never belonged to them. And the lost child stays out of the way. They learn early that invisibility is the safest form of self-protection, but that protection comes at the cost of existence. You don't choose these roles, you adjust to them. And once you've adjusted, they're hard to escape, because they come with conditions. If you try to step out of role, you're corrected. If you're the golden child and you falter, the approval vanishes. If you're the scapegoat and you succeed, you're resented. If you're the lost child and you speak, you're punished for disrupting the calm. The system needs you to stay in character because the roles aren't just emotional containers, they're behavioral contracts. What makes this even harder is that the roles define how you see your sibling. You don't just see them as a person, you see them as a contrast. The golden child becomes the standard you resent. The scapegoat becomes the threat you avoid. The lost child becomes the ghost you envy or forget. Each sibling is reduced to their function, not by choice, but by survival. Because if you see them clearly, if you recognize their pain, you might have to feel your own. And in a system that punishes vulnerability, clarity is dangerous. So you adapt, you resent them, you distance, you blame, but you're not reacting to who they are. You're reacting to what the system made them represent. That's how narcissistic families survive, by casting children into emotional roles and then watching them struggle to break free without ever questioning who handed them the script. In the next section, we'll expose what happens when one child tries to walk off the stage, when survival becomes too heavy to carry, and the old role no longer fits. Because in these families, healing doesn't look like transformation. It looks like betrayal. Every system resists disruption, especially one built on illusion. In a narcissistic family, the roles you were given aren't just habits, they're anchors. They keep the emotional economy intact. So when you start to change, to step out of your assigned identity, the system doesn't cheer, it tightens, because what looks like healing to you feels like betrayal to them. Maybe you were the golden child, the proof of your parents' competence. You did everything right. You kept quiet. You performed well. You made them look good. But one day, you stop. You begin setting boundaries, naming pain, or choosing your own path. And suddenly, the affection disappears. You feel the temperature shift, not because you failed, but because you stepped out of character. The person they rewarded no longer exists, and the person you've become is now a threat. Or maybe you were the scapegoat. You held the family's tension. You absorbed the blame, the chaos, the rejection. You were used to conflict, but you learned how to speak the truth anyway. You went to therapy. You started healing, and that clarity made you dangerous, because scapegoats aren't allowed to be right. If you start making sense, the whole narrative falls apart, and the family needs the narrative more than they need you. Even the lost child, the one who disappeared into silence, eventually faces resistance. You spent years staying quiet to avoid the spotlight, but silence becomes a cage. And if you start to speak, if you claim space or express needs, you'll feel the discomfort ripple through everyone else. Not because your voice is wrong, but because it was never part of the design. The moment you change, the system begins to defend itself, not through open aggression, but through subtle recalibrations, coldness, withdrawal, guilt, passive remarks that remind you who you used to be. Siblings may question your growth, not out of spite, but out of fear that their own role is under threat. Because when you exit the script, it calls their performance into question too. This is what makes healing so disorienting. You think it will bring closeness, and sometimes it does, but often it brings distance first, because transformation isn't seen as progress, it's seen as abandonment. You were predictable, you were useful, you fit, and now you don't. The system can't absorb who you've become, so it tries to pull you back into who you were. This isn't proof that you're wrong, it's proof that you're waking up. The pushback isn't a signal to stop, it's a sign that the emotional economy is being interrupted, that the transaction you once offered, obedience in exchange for love, is no longer available, and that, to a system built on control, is unacceptable. In the next section, we'll revisit the sibling you were told to resent, and see what happens when you stop performing and start seeing. Because they weren't the villain, they were a mirror, And the real enemy was never them. It was the structure that pitted you against each other. You weren't supposed to hate each other, but the system needed you to. Because resentment between siblings is the easiest way to keep them from seeing the real source of pain. If you're watching your brother, you're not watching the parent. If you're blaming your sister, you're not questioning the system. That was the design all along, to keep you divided, distracted, emotionally disoriented. What most people don't realize is that sibling rivalry in narcissistic families doesn't start with personality. It starts with placement. You were positioned. One of you was cast as the good one, the reliable one, the responsible one. The other was framed as the rebel, the disappointment, the burden. And once the roles were set, affection followed the script. The golden child received praise and protection, but only in exchange for performance. The scapegoat received punishment, but also the burden of truth. And the lost child received nothing at all, just absence, just silence. What you saw in your sibling wasn't clarity, it was distortion. You didn't see the person. You saw the consequences of their role. You saw how they survived, not what they felt. Maybe they kept achieving, and you resented the attention they got. Maybe they disappeared, and you called it weakness. Maybe they fought back, and you saw them as selfish or dramatic. But what you missed, what you were never allowed to see, was that they were surviving too. That's the tragedy. Not that you were different, but that your differences were used against you. You weren't enemies. You were adaptations. Their obedience wasn't betrayal. It was fear. Their silence wasn't arrogance. It was exhaustion. Their rebellion wasn't personal. It was protest. But when love is conditional, you don't see nuance. You see threat. Every moment they succeeded felt like a loss for you. Every time they were favored, your value felt revoked. Not because you were petty, but because that's how the economy was designed. This is why healing the sibling bond is so hard. Because by the time you understand the system, years of resentment have hardened. You've built narratives around their choices. You've stored memories filtered through the lens of competition. You've blamed them for the affection you never received, the validation you couldn't earn, the silence you had to survive, and maybe they blamed you too. But the truth is, neither of you started this. You both inherited a script and were told it was your identity. You weren't rivals. You were reflections, different expressions of the same scarcity. And if you want to break the cycle, that's where it starts. Not with reunion, not with reconciliation, but with recognition. Because once you stop blaming the person, you can start confronting the pattern. And once you see them clearly, not as the enemy, but as someone who carried a different wound, you stop competing for affection and start grieving what was stolen from both of you. And now we'll explore what that grief unlocks and what freedom actually looks like when you no longer perform, compare, or beg. Because affection was never the problem. Scarcity was, and you're finally allowed to stop bidding for love. The hardest part to accept is that the scarcity was never real. You spent years believing love was limited, that only one child could be safe, valued, or close at a time. But that was never about love. That was about control. The parent didn't limit affection because they lacked it. They limited it because it gave them power. And as long as you believed you had to earn it, they never had to offer it freely. That's the mechanism. Keep the children performing and no one questions the conditions. Keep them comparing and no one connects. Keep them afraid of being replaced and no one walks away. It's not an accident. It's a psychological strategy, a system that turns the need for love into a tool of manipulation. And the moment you see it for what it is, everything shifts. You realize you don't have to compete anymore. You don't have to prove your worth, outperform your sibling, or rehearse the right version of yourself just to feel safe. Because safety isn't something they were protecting. It was something they were withholding. To keep you compliant, to keep you close, but never close enough to threaten the system. So what does freedom look like? It looks like refusing to play the role, not just in front of them, but in your own mind. It looks like no longer checking whether your success will make someone else uncomfortable. No longer silencing your pain so the family can stay stable. No longer shrinking because someone else still needs you small. It looks like seeing your sibling not through the lens of who they were, but who they were forced to be. It means knowing you don't need an apology to step out of resentment, because forgiveness doesn't require their readiness. It only requires your refusal to keep competing for affection that was never supposed to be earned. You don't have to fix the relationship. You don't have to force closeness. You only have to exit the economy, because as long as you're bidding for connection, the system survives inside you. But the moment you stop, truly stop, you begin to breathe in a different way. You stop tracking their approval. You stop managing their distance. You stop needing their love to make your life feel real. This isn't peace because they changed. It's peace because you did. You stopped negotiating your existence through a rigged system. You stopped measuring your value in contrast to someone else's wounds. And in doing so, you ended the game. Affection was never scarce. It was made scarce. And the minute you stop treating it like a prize, you remember who you were before you started performing. Not the scapegoat, not the golden child, not the lost one, just you. And you were never too much. You were just too free for a system built on scarcity to tolerate. If you were never cast in that role, who would you have become?